Welcome to the Cowboy Up Podcast, where talk is all about the West. This episode is brought to you by White Stallion Ranch and produced by Cowboy Spirit USA. In 1938, the Colorado River was renowned as the most dangerous river in the world. So why would two women botanists join a group of amateur boatmen on a voyage down the churning white waters? Melissa Sevigny, author of the new book Brave the Wild River, joins Russell and Alan to talk about one of the most daring Grand Canyon trips ever taken, and all in the name of science.
Morning, Alan. I've got a little note here that today is our final episode of season 3. We've been at it 3 great years.
Well, I hope I don't look 3 years older. It seems like only 15 minutes and not 3 years. So,
well, you may, but my eyes are 3 years worse. So I don't know. But,
well, it's hard to believe, but it's been fun. So pat on your back for making all this work.
Well, our first episode posted June 12th, 2020, and, it's a different world than then.
Well, it gives me a spark to come out here every Monday, so I'm tickled that it's been what it's been.
Yep, no, absolutely. Well, we're wrapping up this season with a perfect topic, the Grand Canyon. It's with a focus on a very different time, the summer of 1938. Melissa Sevigny joins us from Flagstaff, what a great place to be about now, to talk about her brand new book, Brave the Wild River, the untold story of two women who mapped the botany of the Grand Canyon. And Melissa is a science journalist at public radio station KNAU. And, of course, with NAU up there, Northern Arizona University, just beautiful place. She's worked in water policy, sustainable agriculture, space exploration. Her other books include Under Desert Skies and Mythical River. And we're really happy to have you. Welcome to our Cowboy Up podcast, Melissa.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, and by the way, congratulations on the great review of Brave the Wild River in yesterday's New York Times book review. That's a pretty big deal.
Oh, thanks so much. That was definitely a dream come true.
I'll bet.
Well, I'm in awe of a fellow Arizonan and how you're involved with the Grand Canyon, because can't think of anything more of a place to be in love with and to be interested in than our great Grand Canyon.
Of course, yeah, it's such a special and wonderful place.
What originally just attached you to Grand Canyon? Have you just always, has it been a big thing in your life, or was there an event that you gravitated to?
Well, I did grow up, and my mother bundled me and my sisters into the car, and we'd drive up on these crazy road trips. And the Grand Canyon was always one of those special stops. And I remember really wanting to write about it. Even as a child, I'd bring my little notebook along and just try to capture, a description of what the Grand Canyon looks like, which is pretty much impossible to do. But I also was really fascinated with geology as a child. I wanted to be a geologist. So, of course, the Grand Canyon, just a dream.
Would you call yourself an academician?
I probably would not call myself that. I'm not sure I can pronounce that word.
Well, I probably pronounced it wrong, but anyway.
But I've always loved to learn, I guess, and so I've often ended up working at universities for that reason, because I just like to learn new things.
Well, talk about am I getting this name right? Elzada Clover.
Elveda clover. Yes.
Elveda. I gotta get better glasses. Well, tell us about Elveda.
So Elveda Clover was a botanist. She was 41 years old in 1938. At the time, she decided to go on this kind of crazy Colorado River trip. And really just what a wonderful person to write about. She had a fascinating life. She grew up on a farm in Nebraska and, eventually ended up in Texas. And in Texas, she became kind of obsessed with cactus. She wanted to make a complete collection of all of the cacti in the Southwest. And so she went and got her PhD in botany at the University of Michigan. And she started looking around for, a better job or for funding or for some kind of support for this dream and really couldn't find it. So she would end up on her own dime, just driving out west as far as she could go and picking up cactus. And this is what she was doing when she met a man named Norm Nevels, who wanted to start a commercial river running business through the Grand Canyon. And they cooked up this crazy plan that they were going to build some boats and recruit some people and set off down this very wild river. And so she could get her cactus collection.
How many years ago was that? That sounds like a long time ago.
A long time ago. We're actually, they set off on this trip on June 20th, 1938. So we're right at I guess this week is the 85th anniversary of them starting that trip.
And is the Grand Canyon a great place to find cactus?
Well, the funny thing is at the time they really didn't know what they were going to find.
Okay.
Nobody had made a comprehensive plant list through the region of the Colorado River. They went down. They started actually on the Green River, and then they rafted Cataract Canyon, Glen Canyon, which of course today is under Lake Powell, but it wasn't at the time, and then the Grand Canyon. And really had no idea what they were going to find in terms of the plant life. There was a perception at the time that it might just be this like barren kind of wasteland of rock and water with like hardly any plants. And of course, that's not what they found at all. There's just this wonderful diversity of plant life that's constantly changing as you move downriver.
Interesting. I one time when I was in my second half of my 20s, I hiked down and back up in one day because they didn't have services. They'd had a flood, and that was too much for anybody to do, especially if you're not equipped for it. So I'm a little foggy on the bottom at this point, but I've been to the Grand Canyon many times. How did the partnership with Lois Jotter, is that correct? How did that happen?
That's right. So Lois Jotter was one of L. Zeta Clover's students at the University of Michigan. She was a generation younger. She was 24 years old at the time of this river trip. And the two of them had been, kind of a mentor and a student, but also they became close friends, and they actually ended up living together for a couple of years, to save money on rent on the university campus. They were quite different women, but they had a close friendship, and that was just kind of a joy to write about the two of them deciding to go on this trip together. Alzada Clover, so she came up with this plan that they're going to run the river. She went back to the University of Michigan and she recruited a zoologist named Gene Atkinson to come with her. And then she kind of started looking around for one more scientist. And she decided she needed to invite another woman because it was the 1930s and it would be inappropriate if she disappeared into the wilderness with a group of strange men. So she was trying to find another woman to invite along. And Lois Jotter had a bunch of wonderful qualifications. She knew how to backpack and she was familiar with the outdoors and camping. She was a talented young botanist, but also because they had lived together, they knew that they could stand each other in close quarters for long periods of time, which if you've been on a river trip, is an incredibly important qualification.
How long was that? I'm not sure that I read. How long was that trip in the bottom? How long did they plan it and how long did it end up being?
The whole trip was about 43 days, and they were a little late. It took a little longer than they were expecting. But the whole trip from Green River, Utah to Lake Mead behind Hoover Dam, which was there at the time, it had just been built and the lake was still filling up. That was the end point of the journey, and it took them 43 days to make that trip.
So this was the trip that was managed or facilitated by Norm Nevels, the commercial raft guy. There weren't two trips, it was one trip.
Just one trip, yeah. And this was, so Norm Neville's was kind of technically the trip leader. He had this idea that he was going to start these commercial river running trips, but he had never done the Grand Canyon before. So it was brand new for him as well.
Wow.
So he built the boats and he recruited 2 boatmen to row them, who had never done the Grand Canyon before and had no experience rowing in whitewater. And so, it's 6 of them all together, 3 boatmen and 3 scientists from the University of Michigan. And yeah, none of them really had any idea what they were getting into.
That sounds like a rather aggressive plan, I guess I'd call it.
Right. Yep. They just kind of, Elzada Clover described it as like, we laid out the whole scheme in a couple of minutes, one evening chatting at Mexican Hat Lodge, and they went for it. They decided they were just going to make it happen.
Are these, I assume, are they wood boats?
They're wooden boats. Yes, this is long before rubber rafts
Right.
came along. If you do the canyon today, you probably do it in a rubber raft. But they're wooden boats. They were kind of a new, untested design. Norm Neville sort of scrapped together these boats that he called cataract boats. And they're, kind of like boxy wooden boats. They've got enough, there's a little cockpit in the middle where one person would sit and row. But you had to put 2 people per boat, and the second person didn't have a lot of space, the passenger, and so often they would actually sit on the covered deck of the boat and like hang on to ropes as they were going down the river.
Did they have a lot of wrecks? I mean, that's a rugged stretch, right? I mean, there's some really serious whitewater stretches.
Yes, there's some serious whitewater, not just Grand, but Cataract Canyon too. Yeah. And they left in June, which of course everybody in Arizona knows is, monsoon season, and they're getting some big storms. It's a year kind of like this year where there's some early monsoons and some late snow melt coming down from the mountains. And so they reach the Colorado River when it is very, very high, and none of them are quite prepared for that. So yes, they have some problems in the early days of the trip. A lot of things go wrong.
All right, this begs a little story. Along with this, I start out on my first and only trip down the Grand Canyon. We get in the water, and we haven't gone 15 minutes, and we got sideways against a rock. Here's a rock sticking up in the middle of the river. The boatman just didn't avoid it for some reason, took the wrong track, and we're hung up on this rock. Water going over the boat. Everything in the boat goes out of the boat and down the river, and we're all out in there swimming. And,
terrifying.
With life jackets on, right in the middle of the river, and we're not 5 minutes from when we launched. And so talk about a wreck. And the boatman, I'll keep this as short as I can. The boatman panicked. He didn't know what to do. So he's in the boat trying to do something, which is nothing. He's just throwing up his hands. And so another guy who I'd never met, there were 2 men on the boat, and we just locked eyes. We were talking, but without language, swam around behind that, put the rock on our back and our legs against the boat, pushed the boat around the edge of the rock, grabbed on, and down the river we went. And we saved our own boat right there. But boy, It went from an exciting little launch onto this beautiful river to total disaster in about 30 seconds.
And
yes.
Did you have that same boatman the rest of the ride?
He had diminished stature after that.
But was he still with you for the rest
He was with. His story was he'd been on several trips, but this was his first voyage as captain in command, if that's what you want to call it. And got hung up on the very first rock. And so we kind of, after that, he'd say steer here and steer there, and we'd say why, but we didn't have.
And how long was the ride? Was it a week?
Well, we were several, 4 days or something.
4 days?
Yeah.
Wow.
4 or 5 days, but that was, 10 minutes into the ride and all of our luggage was floating down the river, and our dignity was destroyed.
Nothing compared to his, I suspect.
I think, yeah. Sorry, but that was.
No, that's kind of similar to what happened to them in 1938, actually. I mean, and gosh, today, you can have those kinds of things happen today, even with all of our wonderful equipment and very detailed maps. And, 1938, they didn't have an emergency radio. They really didn't have a great idea of what was coming up around the bend. And they're in these kind of, untested wooden boats, which, the very first hour that they reach the Colorado River, they tie up the boats and they go to look at the very first rapid, and they're trying to figure out, the best way to navigate the waves and the rocks. And one of the boats pulls away. It wasn't tied properly, and it pulls away. And you have to remember, all of their food supplies are split between these three boats, and it's the start of the trip. So if they lose that boat, they're going to be in big trouble. And Lois Jotter and her boatman go jump in one of the other boats and they chase it. And so her first experience with whitewater on the Colorado River is chasing this runaway boat, 4 miles down through this series of rapids that are basically just like one long rapid. And yes, that culminates in her getting stranded on the riverbank all night by herself, which if it had happened to me, I would have been, I think, terrified in that moment. But she later wrote a letter to her mother, and she said that she had a lovely time. So I think that tells you something about her personality.
When she's alone that night, where's her boatman?
So they do find the runaway boat, and it's by this time it's nightfall, and they're now 4 miles away from their companions. So they tie up the boats, and her boatman says, "I'm going to walk back and tell everybody that we're still alive, and then I'll come back for you." But he doesn't come back. He doesn't make it. He starts off again, and the moon goes down, and it's pitch black, and there's rattlesnakes, and he just doesn't make it back to her. So she has no idea why he doesn't return, but she makes a campfire. She has some toast and jam. She's got all of the bedding and almost all of the food, and so she's having a really great night. And the rest of them are freezing cold and miserable and not having a good time at all.
Wow. Well, on that, I think we're gonna grab a quick break.
And thank you, Russell. Thank you, Alan and Melissa, for, again, more stories of the great Western tradition. As Lynn tells you every time we come together, this is produced by Cowboy Spirit USA, which is a part of whatittakesradio.com. We are one of the premier producers of podcasts for organizations like the White Stallion Ranch, the Dude Ranch Association, and there are more programs yet to come. The popularity of those traditions, Yellowstone, now 1883, there are people who want to hear stories of the West, and perhaps you'd like to be aware of this opportunity. We're going to be producing, along with a number of colleagues, some other programs, Frontier Firearms. We're going to be talking about those legendary weapons of the West, lawmen. Yes, lawmen and ladies of the West. The people who helped civilize the great Western tradition. And Tombstone, that incredible town, and the stories that come out of there. So these are some of the programs we have in mind, and production is starting for launches in the fall. And we'd be grateful if you'd say, hey, those sound like things that we'd like to be involved in, either in the production of, the sponsorship of, or in some way we would like very much to have our name and our company and our opportunity on the radio. So if that is the case, I'd love to hear from you. Reach out to me at stan@witradio.net. Stan, S-T-A-N, @witradio.net. And say, I would like to know how my business and how my organization could be a part of the ongoing fascination with stories of the West. Hey, thank you for your time. Now, back to the program.
So, Melissa, when they've done the 43 days and they've ended at Meade behind the dam there as the lake was filling, and once the story's out, what kind of press did they get? How did the public see them?
Yeah, it was really fascinating to read the newspaper articles about this trip because they were quite extraordinary and often extremely inaccurate. At the start of the trip, there was a lot of press about the fact that they were women. There was a lot of focus on the fact that the one woman on record, the one non-native woman who had tried to do the Grand Canyon, was named Bessie Hyde. A decade earlier, she had gone on a honeymoon trip through the Grand Canyon, and she and her husband had disappeared. And to this day, we have no idea what happened to them. But the newspapers kept bringing this up, and they kept saying things like, women can't do this. Like, women can't run the Colorado River. And so there was a lot of focus on their gender. And Elzada and Lois were really frustrated by that, because they wanted to see, they wanted the public to see them as serious scientists, as botanists who were making this incredibly important plant collection of this region. And instead people kept asking them, do you think women can do everything a man can do? And, describing their clothes and how they were sunburned and all of this stuff about their physical appearance. It was quite frustrating for them. There was a lot of press early in the trip, but it was mostly focused on kind of this idea that they weren't going to make it. It was all going to go wrong. The water was too big. The boats were badly designed. And, one newspaper said the women are one of the hazards because they're not going to be able to help in an emergency, which of course was, ridiculous. They probably had the coolest heads of everybody on the trip. Interestingly, once they succeed and get to Lake Mead and, they've done what they set out to do, there's still press, but there's not as much, because I think the journalists were not that interested in writing a story about women succeeding at running the Colorado River. They wanted to write a story about how the boats were going to smash up and it was all going to go wrong.
Better story if they were all killed.
Exactly. Yeah. So the press is quite muted afterwards. And, there's coverage. There's newspaper stories that come up, even a decade later, that Elzada Clover was incredibly frustrated by, just referring to her as the first woman to succeed at running the Grand Canyon. She really didn't like that label for two reasons. I think one is that she always would correct people and say that she was the first non-native woman to make this trip. She was aware that the Colorado River has this long indigenous history, but also because she wanted people to remember her as a botanist. And really, to this day, that hasn't really happened. And that's one of the things I'm hoping to change with this book.
There really are two stories, aren't there? They're going down a river that nobody on the trip has done before in boats that are a unique design that are wood. So if they hit Allen's rock, they might end up in two pieces rather than wrapped around the rock like a rubber raft did. I didn't ask Allen if his were wood, but so there's that amazing adventure accomplishment, and then there's the botany, and I can see where the botany would get left behind a little bit because we like those adventure stories.
Right. Yeah. And I wanted to approach it, I'm a science writer. I wanted to approach it as a science story, but use the adventure to keep you turning the pages, right? It really is very exciting. A lot of crazy things happen to them on this trip. And I wanted it to be a quick read that just makes you feel like you're on the river with them. So it's definitely an adventure story, but it's also a science story. And it's also a story about the sexism that these women faced.
So, well, I'm sure they faced it everywhere they went in that era. So how big of an accomplishment from a botany perspective was it?
Well, they really managed to make an incredible plant collection, hundreds and hundreds of plant species. They would cut the plants or uproot the plants and press them between newspaper and create these plant presses as they were going down the river. And those original plant specimens are still housed at universities all over the country, including the University of Arizona and the Smithsonian Institution. And they're still available for botanists who want to do research on the plants of this region. They published a couple of papers that have a comprehensive plant list of everything they found and notes about the ecology of the region. And those have actually become more significant with time because they're the only formal plant list published before Glen Canyon Dam was built. So Glen Canyon Dam went up kind of at the head of the Grand Canyon in the 1960s, and it changed everything about the region's ecology, both upriver and downriver.
130 or 40 miles upriver, it changed, didn't it?
Right, something like that. It's probably less than that now with the drought. But Glen Canyon and Lower Cataract are now underwater under Lake Powell. But also downstream, actually, everything changed too in the Grand Canyon because you no longer get big floods coming through. You don't get the low drought periods. The water's colder. It's clearer. Everything has changed for the Grand Canyon because of that dam. So today, when scientists are trying to understand how to protect and restore the Grand Canyon, they have to look back at records before the dam was put in to see what did this region used to look like. And one of those critically important records are these two papers published by Elzada Clover and Lois Jotter.
Interesting. When I'm trying to think how old it would have been, like 1973 when I first went to Lake Powell. And even then there were these little whispers that they needed to decommission, my word, the dam. Yeah. And turn Glen Canyon back. I read and hear a lot more about that. Do you have a thought on that? Should Glen Canyon Dam go away?
Oh gosh, I think it's not as easy as we would like it to be. I think there are a lot of complexities to that question. For example, the exotic fish that are kind of somewhat being held back by the dam. What happens then? The sediment, sure. What happens then? I think it's a fascinating question from a scientific perspective of what that would really look like. I was really interested, Elzada Clover and Lois Jotter were running this river before Glen Canyon Dam went in and not really thinking about that. But Hoover Dam was there. And when they reached the lake, Elzada Clover made notes about how she could see like barrel cacti that were submerged by the rising reservoir and the little spines were sticking up above the surface, and she was fascinated by that. And she wanted to come back and do a study of how the plants were being affected by the reservoir. As far as I could tell, she never had a chance to do that, or she didn't publish the research. But I thought that was quite advanced of her to think about that, because really scientists didn't start seriously looking at the effects of big dams on the Colorado River until about the 70s and onward.
Well, I can imagine it's a huge question. And of course, you mentioned the sediment, because isn't that the stated purpose for Glen Canyon, to trap the sediment and not have it land in Mead?
That was something that I think people were interested in, not silting up Lake Mead. But the real purpose is hydropower and to some extent, water supply for the city of Page. Although there were interesting notes about the Park Service, not wanting driftwood going down the river and clogging up Lake Mead. And so they actually encouraged early river trips to build big bonfires and to burn them, because they thought all that driftwood was going to go down and clog up the reservoir.
Interesting. Well, what's another story about this trip that we want people to buy your book, obviously, so we're just going to tease them a little here.
Oh yes, let's do that. Yeah, one of my favorite, very unexpected stories was the story of Buzz Holmstrom, who's one of the characters in the book. And he kind of starts out as a bit of a villain. So Buzz Holmstrom was a very famous river runner at the time. He had done the Grand Canyon in a solo trip in 1937. And there was a lot of press, and he was referred to as a He-Man's hero. There was this idea that he was like this incredibly heroic kind of masculine figure who had done this incredible thing. And he had said in the Saturday Evening Post that women didn't belong on the Colorado River. And that article was published the same month that Elzada Clover and Lois Jotter told their whole family that they were doing this trip. And so he kind of starts out in the story as a villain. And when I first started writing it, I was like, he's going to be this villainous figure that just hangs over them, that says they're not supposed to be doing this. But then, unexpectedly, he shows up at Lee's Ferry when they're taking a break, their first layover, halfway through the trip at the head of the Grand Canyon, to meet them. And he spends about a day and a half with Lois Jotter, who's just hanging out at Lee's Ferry. And over the course of that time, she changes his mind about women. And I found a letter that he wrote to his mother right after meeting Lois, where he says the women on the trip are really doing better than the men. And so he sort of he has this redemptive arc in the story. And I won't give it all away, but he shows up again at the very end of the book, where he really helps these women with, there's kind of a catastrophe that befalls their plant collection very, very late in the story. And Buzz Holmstrom steps in and helps rescue things. I won't give it all away, but I wasn't expecting that, and it was a wonderful kind of story arc that gets woven into this book.
Where'd you do your research on this?
So the two women kept diaries that they had the foresight to save and to donate to archives before they died. One of them is here at Northern Arizona University, and the other is at the University of Michigan. They also kept a lot of notes, letters, scrapbook kind of materials. And there's other archives kind of scattered around the country that have diaries from some of the men on the trip and some other materials. And I also was able to track down some of their family members and some of their former students to get an idea of like who these two women were. They really were both extraordinary in different ways. And so it was kind of a delight to track down some of their relatives and students who talked about just how passionate they were about this river trip and about the natural world.
Well, you're so thorough with your research and how you present things. What's next on your agenda? What's on the drawing boards for you?
Oh gosh, I'm gonna need a little break. I work on these projects, my book writing projects on my weekends, because I do have a full-time job. So that was a string of Saturdays where I did nothing else for about 4.5 years, and I don't have another project in mind yet. But I did find it very satisfying to do this work of kind of recovering a story about female scientists that hasn't really gotten widely shared. And so I'm hoping to do more of that in the future.
Well, people are going to want to get Brave the Wild River, the untold story of two women who mapped the botany of the Grand Canyon. I assume it's available all the regular places.
Yes. Yep. You can get it anywhere you buy books normally. And there's also an audiobook edition, by the way, narrated by Elizabeth Wiley, if anyone's interested in that. But yes, I encourage you to ask at your local independent bookseller or your library or wherever you normally buy books.
Right. And it's always, it's interesting how authors always do the right thing and say, go ask for it at that local bookshop and Can they learn about, do you have a website where they can learn about your other books, Under Desert Skies and Mythical River?
I do, yes. If you Google my name, it's just www.melissasevigny.com. Sevigny is Sevigny.
Yeah, and so we want to spell that last again because it's not quite how it sounds, Sevigny. And so they can just do a web search and there you are?
And there I am. I have a website that talks about all of my books and I've got some upcoming events where I'll be talking about this one that people can find there as well.
Any events here in Tucson?
I just did an event in Tucson. I was there this last weekend, actually.
Oh, okay.
But I'm hoping I'll be back. I should be back at least for the Tucson Festival of Books next year. So. Well,
we're sorry we missed you. And you people, particularly in northern Arizona, Flagstaff area, they can look for you at the public radio station KNAU.
That's right. Yep.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much.
Great for you to be on the program today.
Thank you so much. This was a lot of fun.
Well, love talking about rivers and river stories and can't let it go without one of my own. I had done several river trips, and so I, in my own eyes, became Captain Bligh. I was, in charge of, or should have been. So I decided to run the Gila River, which came through the ranch, about 10 miles through the ranch, and it heads up in the mountains up near Silver City, up in the White Mountains up near Silver City. And so anyway, I got all prepared and got a raft and got the family and, all that we needed and launched where the river comes through Red Rock and then go about 4 miles down the river and it hits the edge of the ranch and then it goes through the ranch for about 10 miles. So we were going to, and both sides of the river are big bluffs. Nobody lives there. It's down through a deep canyon. rather scenic. And so I don't know how many people had ever rafted that before, or if any, I don't know. But anyway, I decided I wanted to take my family. And so got all prepared and got a raft and got everybody in it. We get on, and fortunately or unfortunately, when we picked the time, it had been high water. It had been maybe a flood or at least a lot of high water, and it was going down. So I watched it go down to where it was at a good level to raft, but it was on the decline, which comes into the story. So we get in the raft, and we go about a mile. We're not even into the boxed up part of the river yet. And we come around this corner, and the river has eaten out on the west side out into a farmer's field there. And the fence was hanging out in the water. It hadn't washed the fence away. And here's this fence stretched out across the water and a loop of the river going under the water. So, of course, we got carried by the stream right around that corner. And naturally, it brought us right up against this barbed wire fence that's hanging out in the water. We hit the barbed wire fence, and it takes the whole side of our raft out. Boom, and we're in the water. Done. So we're floating in the water, and, in 10 seconds, we don't even see this water, this fence or anything. We're just in the water, and then all of a sudden, here's the fence, and then we're in the water. So we're floating down, and I said, swim back over to the other side, because that's where our car was. We were only about a mile below our car. And I said, swim over to the other side. So we did. And there was a tree there with the roots hanging out in the water. And there were some roots, out there. So we grab onto a root and climb out, and the kids climbed out. My wife, however, floated down and hit with her chest one of the roots that was out hanging in the water. And the water was pushing her against this root with her chest, pouring over the top of her head. She wasn't choking because the water wasn't in her mouth, but she was being held against this root and water pushing her there. And she panicked and was screaming, help me, get me out of here. And I got the kids out and then grabbed her, and I wasn't strong enough to pull her against the water. She was just caught against that root. And so, and this all happened so fast, you don't have time to be frightened. But I thought, I got to do something, and I got to do it right, because this is kind of life and death here. I mean, she could drown or something bad could happen. Then I sized it up, and so I asked her, I said, well, are your feet in the roots underneath? And she wiggled her feet and said, no, my feet are free. And I said, well, then I've got to push you under this root, and you come up the other side, because I wasn't strong enough to pull her up against the water, up out. And she was screaming, no, don't push me underwater. And I'm thinking, this is life or death, and a decision has to be made, right now. So I just grabbed her and gave a big old push. She popped underneath and up the other side, and I grabbed her and pulled her out. But I've long time thought, what that could have gone about 8 different ways, and was just lucky that it worked just the way it did, and pulled her out of the water. And she and I both were crying and thankful that she was still alive on the other side. And the whole incident happened in no more than a minute, but it was a scary thing. And I've thought about it many, many times in the past. And maybe I did something right. I did something wrong to put us in the river. I know that much, but kind of a scary moment.
Was that the only attempt?
Yeah, didn't go back and try that another time. I tried to recover all of our goods scattered up and down the river for a ways, and thank goodness to be done with that. Yeah, I think that was the last voyage of Captain Bligh on the river.
And that's a wrap from the Grand Canyon State. Let us know if you've taken a rafting trip down the Colorado River and any adventures your group had. We'll share on our website. A cowboy thanks to Stan Husted's production team. Tune in next week when we explore national parks beyond the Grand Canyon with Marie Buck, Executive Director of Western National Parks. Until then, this is Lynn Weezy Sneed, reminding you to sit tall and ride safe.